In tonight's episode, we bring you three chilling stories from across Asia, each one rooted in whispers, shadows, and the kind of nights that never truly end. The first takes us to Hong Kong, right in the crowded heart of Causeway Bay. On the surface, it's all neon lights, endless shopping malls, and apartments stacked high above the streets. But hidden among those towers are flats with secrets so dark that even the locals avoid speaking of them. One such flat was rented by a young woman on a short business trip. Clean, modern, and well-kept, it looked like the perfect place to stay. Yet from the very first night, she felt something was wrong. The air was heavy, the silence unsettled, and soon the ordinary turned into something she could never explain. This is the haunted flat of Causeway Bay. She was a young professional from Singapore, the kind of traveler who liked things simple and efficient. Work brought her to Hong Kong for just under a week, and instead of booking a hotel, she decided to try something different. She found a flat on Airbnb, tucked away in Causeway Bay, one of the busiest districts of the city. Photos showed a clean, modern space, white walls, sleek furniture, a cozy bedroom. Everything looked perfect. The reviews were short but positive, and the location was unbeatable, right above the endless hum of shops and restaurants. For her, it seemed like the perfect balance of work and comfort. But the moment she stepped inside, something about the place felt strangely wrong. The air was cool, too cool, as if the apartment had been shut off from the world for far too long. The windows rattled faintly, even though the night outside was calm. She brushed it off as travel fatigue. Long flights always made her hyper-aware. That first evening, she unpacked, set her laptop on the dining table, and prepared for the week ahead. The lights above flickered once, and then steadied. The building was old, she reminded herself, though the flat looked freshly renovated. She convinced herself there was nothing to worry about. Outside, Causeway Bay buzzed, with noise and neon, but in here, the silence pressed in tight, almost like the walls were listening. By the time she slipped into bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that the flat was not as empty as it seemed. Something unseen lingered just beyond the edge of sight, waiting for the moment she finally closed her eyes. The first night passed in restless silence. She woke often, listening to the faint hum of the city outside, and eventually convinced herself it was just nerves from being in a new place. By the second night, though, the flat began to show its teeth. It started subtly with noises that didn't belong. While she worked late at the dining table, she heard footsteps in the hallway outside her bedroom. Slow, steady pacing, as if someone was walking from one end to the other, pausing, then turning back again. She froze, listening. The sound was unmistakable. It wasn't the echo of neighbors, not the shuffle of someone upstairs. It was right there, just beyond the thin wooden door of her room. She sat perfectly still, the screen of her laptop glowing in front of her. Minutes passed, the footsteps continued, dragging softly against the floorboards, then stopping altogether. Gathering what little courage she had, she stood, crossed the small living space, and pulled open the bedroom door. The hallway was empty. The air felt colder there, heavier, almost metallic in taste. She flicked on the hallway light and stared down its length, half expecting someone to appear at the far end. Nothing. Only silence. She shut the door quickly and leaned against it, trying to slow her breathing. By the next morning, she decided not to dwell on it. Apartments in Hong Kong were crowded, she told herself. Sounds carried. Maybe it was another tenant. Maybe it was the pipes. Maybe her imagination had turned exhaustion into footsteps. But deep down, the explanation didn't sit right. The sounds were too clear, too deliberate. Still, she went about her day. Meetings, phone calls, crowded streets. And yet, returning that evening, stepping back into the flat, she noticed something unsettling. The air again was cool, almost damp, the kind of chill that clung to her skin. As she unpacked groceries in the kitchen, she realized she was listening, waiting, bracing for those footsteps to return. She couldn't explain why, but she already felt watched, as though the apartment was aware of her and not particularly welcoming. Something about it wanted her to know she wasn't alone. On the third night, the unease grew teeth. She had just drifted into a shallow sleep when the sound returned, but this time it wasn't footsteps. It was crying. Soft at first, a broken whisper of grief, as if someone were trying not to be heard. She jolted awake, certain the sound had come from right beside her bed. In the dim light spilling through the curtains, the room was empty. Her pulse hammered as she fumbled for the lamp and switched it on. The crying didn't stop. It shifted. The sound moved away, slipping through the doorway into the living room. A woman's sobs, low and unrelenting, echoing off the bare walls. She crept forward, barefoot on the cold floor, her throat tight. But when she reached the living room, the space was exactly as she had left it. Empty, silent. Yet, her skin prickled with the certainty that someone had just been there. The next morning, she mentioned it casually to the building's security guard when passing by. She expected him to laugh, or maybe brush it off as thin walls. Instead, his expression changed. He avoided her eyes, muttered something in Cantonese, and waved her off with unusual urgency. That reaction unsettled her more than the crying itself. Later that day, during a coffee break, she mentioned the odd atmosphere of the flat to a local colleague. He went very still. Then, almost reluctantly, he asked for the exact address. When she told him, he exhaled sharply and shook his head. "That building? People don't rent there if they know," he said. She pressed him, but he wouldn't say more, only muttering, "Hangzha," before changing the subject entirely. By the time she returned that evening, every sound felt magnified. The rattle of the window pane, the creak of the wardrobe, the faint hum of the refrigerator. She sat at the dining table, staring at her untouched dinner, trying to silence the thought that she was sharing the flat with something that wanted her to hear it. And still, she had no answer. Only the knowledge that both the guard and her colleague had reacted in ways that made the silence far more terrifying than the cries. That night, the flat no longer felt like a place to sleep. It felt like a trap. She locked her bedroom door before lying down. Phone in hand, the lamp left on. Midnight crept in with the sound of rain against the windows. She was almost convinced she'd make it through the night, undisturbed, until the crying returned. This time, it wasn't soft. It was loud, raw, filled with despair. The sound came not from the hallway, not from the living room, but from inside her bedroom, right at the foot of her bed. She shot upright, clutching her phone. The lamp still burned, casting a pale glow across the room, and yet the crying grew louder, shaking the air. She whispered hello, her voice trembling, as though someone might actually answer. No one did. Instead, the mattress dipped, as if unseen weight had settled there. The sobs now rattled her bones. She scrambled off the bed, backing against the wall, every nerve screaming, her phone screen lit up with trembling fingers, but she had no idea who to call. Police? The host? Anyone? The crying rose into a wail, echoing around the small room, vibrating in her chest. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Silence filled the flat again, heavy and suffocating. She stood frozen, staring at the indentation on her mattress, still faintly visible. For the first time since she arrived, the thought sank in with crushing clarity. Whatever haunted this place wasn't content to stay in the walls or the hallway. It was inside with her. Her perspective shifted in an instant. This wasn't fatigue or imagination. It wasn't the creaks of an old building. She was living in a flat that wanted her to suffer, and it wasn't going to stop. The next morning, she left the flat as quickly as she could, clutching her bag and avoiding every shadow on her way out. She hadn't slept at all, and the memory of that wailing pressed on her like a weight she couldn't shake. By the time she reached the office, her colleague immediately noticed her pale face and restless eyes. She finally confessed everything. The footsteps, the crying, the dip in the mattress. Her colleague listened silently, then leaned in and asked again for the exact floor and unit number. When she told him, his expression hardened. "That place," he whispered, glancing around as if afraid someone else might hear. "A few years ago, a woman lived there. She ended her life in that very flat. People say she was left undiscovered for days. The building has never been the same since." Her heart sank. The air that felt too cold. The footsteps pacing the hallway. The sobs at her bedside. Suddenly they weren't random, weren't tricks of a tired mind. They were echoes of what had happened there, the grief of someone who had died unseen and alone. Her colleague went on, explaining the phrase he had muttered before, Hangja, stigmatized property. In Hong Kong, once a death happens inside a home, whether by murder, suicide, or even an accident, it becomes tainted. Locals avoid it, fearing the restless spirit that lingers. Those flats are hard to rent, so the prices drop, sometimes by nearly half. For outsiders, it looks like a bargain. For those who know, it's a curse. As the meaning sank in, she realized the flat wasn't simply haunted. She had been invited, unknowingly, into someone's sorrow. The crying she heard wasn't meant to frighten her. It was the sound of grief, trapped between walls, replaying again and again, long after the living had moved on. That evening, she didn't bother returning to the flat. She booked a last-minute hotel room and left her belongings behind, too shaken to set foot inside again. The thought of walking back through that door, of hearing those cries start up once more, was unbearable. When she finally messaged the host, she kept her explanation vague, urgent business changes, an early departure. The reply was polite, almost too quick, as if they'd heard it all before. No questions asked, no surprise. Days later, after her flight home, she received one last notification from the Airbnb app, a request from the host asking if she'd like to leave a review. Her finger hovered over the screen. What could she possibly write? That the flat was spotless, modern, exactly as pictured? Or that at night, when the lights went out, she was never truly alone? She closed the app without answering. Some places don't need reviews. They write their own. The haunted flat in Causeway Bay was only the beginning. Because tonight, we don't just stay in Hong Kong. Our journey continues across the sea into the quiet back streets of Kyoto, Japan. Here, tradition lingers in every wooden beam and sliding door, where old houses breathe with centuries of history. Some people book them for the charm, the beauty, the promise of stepping back in time. But not every guest house welcomes you kindly. Two friends thought they had found the perfect escape, a chance to live inside a piece of old Japan. What they didn't realize was that the walls of their Machiya held memories that refused to fade, and on their very first night, those memories began to move. Two friends from Europe had always dreamed of visiting Kyoto, the city of temples, tea houses, and timeless tradition. Instead of staying in a sleek hotel, they decided to immerse themselves in something more authentic, a machiya. These traditional wooden townhouses line the narrow alleys of Kyoto, their latticework facades and sliding doors whispering of centuries past. Through Airbnb, they found one such house. Over 200 years old, it promised tatami mat floors, paper-screened doors, and a small garden where the wind carried the scent of pine. When they arrived, the house felt like a portal to another age. Lantern lights spilled across the polished wood. Shadows stretched long across the tatami, and the quiet inside contrasted sharply with the bustle of the city outside. It felt calm, almost too calm, as if the house itself were holding its breath. They placed their bags down, laughed at the creak of the floorboards, and marveled at the idea of sleeping under a roof that had stood since the days of samurai. But as evening fell, a strange heaviness settled in. The air inside was cooler than the summer night outside, carrying a faint dampness, like rain-soaked fabric left to dry indoors. The friends joked nervously about how thin the walls seemed, how easy it would be to hear neighbors moving about. Still, the place enchanted them. They slid open the doors, explored every corner, and finally gathered around the low table to share their plans for the week. It was exactly what they had hoped for, until the silence deepened into something else, a kind of watchfulness, a presence they couldn't quite name. And as darkness wrapped around the old beams of the Machiya, they would soon discover that not every memory inside those walls was willing to sleep. Their first night in the Machiya began quietly enough. After a long day of sightseeing, they settled onto their futons laid neatly across the tatami mats. The hum of Kyoto at night, distant cicadas, the soft trickle of water from the narrow canals outside soon lulled them towards sleep. The house creaked, occasionally the way old wood does, and they found it almost comforting, like the building itself was breathing. But sometime past midnight, one of them stirred awake. At first he thought it was the wind. A faint sliding sound drifted through the stillness. Then another. The distinct rumble of wooden doors gliding along their tracks. He lay still, listening as door after door opened and closed, as if someone was walking slowly through the house, checking each room one by one. He nudged his friend awake, whispering that someone was inside. Both of them lay frozen, listening to the rhythmic slide and thud, echoing from the darkened hallway. After what felt like an eternity, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was even heavier than before. In the morning, they tried to laugh it off. "It's probably the neighbors," one suggested. "These walls are like paper." The other wasn't so sure. To ease their minds, they decided to check. They slid open the doors in the hallway one by one, expecting to find connecting rooms or maybe thin partitions that explained the noises. Instead, each door revealed the same thing. Small, empty storage spaces, dusty shelves, bare wooden floors, places far too cramped for anyone to walk through. They exchanged uneasy glances. The noise hadn't come from outside. It had come from within the house. Yet, there was no sign of anyone else. As they sat at the low table with their morning tea, they avoided mentioning it again, though both of them felt the same creeping thought. The doors had moved, but not by human hands. And the house, with its calm ancient face, seemed to be watching how they would react. That second night, the Machiya no longer felt charming. The air inside seemed heavier, colder, as though the thin walls held back more than the summer heat. Determined not to spook themselves, the friends laid out their futons again, joking about the noises of the previous night. Yet beneath the laughter, both of them kept glancing toward the hallway, half expecting the sliding doors to stir again. Sometime after midnight, the younger of the two woke with a start. He didn't know why at first. The house was quiet. Still. But as his eyes adjusted to the pale glow of moonlight filtering through the paper screens, he froze. At the low tatami mat table in the center of the room, a figure knelt in silence. Its shape was unmistakable. A woman in a dark kimono, her posture rigid, her hands resting carefully as though preparing to serve tea. He blinked, and the figure seemed to waver, as though it were made of smoke. He blinked again, and it was gone. The room was empty, the table bare. Yet the lingering sense of someone's presence made his skin crawl. He shook his friend awake, whispering what he'd seen. The friend dismissed it at first, muttering that it must have been a dream. But as he turned over, his gaze shifted to the hallway, and both of them heard it together this time. The sound of sliding doors again. Slow, patient. From the far end of the house, moving closer, one after another. The next morning, bleary-eyed and unsettled, they decided to confront the host. When asked, he gave a strained laugh. the kind of laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Old houses make sounds," he said, avoiding their gaze. But when pressed, his tone changed. He admitted the house was over 2 centuries old and, after a long pause, added that locals believed a widow once lived there, alone for many years after her husband's death. Some said she never left, still tending to her home as she always had. The friends exchanged a look. The noises, the figure, the silence that followed. It was no longer just creaking wood. The Machiya seemed to remember her, and wanted them to remember her too. That night, neither of them wanted to sleep. They left the lanterns burning low, casting a warm but uneasy glow across the paper walls. Every creak of the beams, every sigh of the wind outside made them flinch. They sat at the low table, sipping tea in silence, waiting for something to happen. It didn't take long. The sliding doors stirred again. This time, they didn't open one at a time. They all seemed to shift together, a chorus of wood and paper trembling through the house. The friends froze, staring as the hallway darkened, as if something unseen had passed through every room at once. Then, from the corner of their vision, they saw her again. The figure of a woman knelt at the table with them, her presence clearer than before. Her head was bowed, her hair loose around her shoulders. In the flicker of lantern light, they could see the faint outline of her face, pale, expressionless, as if carved from the air itself. Her hands moved slightly, lifting an invisible cup to her lips. One of the friends gasped and reached out instinctively, his hand brushing nothing but air. The woman vanished instantly, like smoke dispersing in wind. But the cup on the table, an ordinary ceramic teacup they hadn't touched, was now filled halfway with water. The two of them stared at it, hearts pounding, unable to speak. The house had given them proof. It wasn't just a trick of tired eyes or creaking doors. Something lived here still, something that sat with them at the table, drinking from the same cup. In that moment, their perspective shifted completely. They weren't guests inside an old home. They were intruders in someone else's nightly routine. And she wasn't asking them to leave. She was simply continuing as if she had never died at all. The following morning, sunlight streamed into the Machiya as though nothing had happened. Yet the two friends sat in silence, staring at the untouched teacup still resting on the table. The water inside glimmered faintly, proof that the night before had not been a dream. Neither of them wanted to pour it out. Somehow, it felt wrong, like discarding an offering meant for someone else. When the host arrived later that day to check on the house, they couldn't hold back. They told him everything. The sliding doors, the shadowy figure, the teacup filled on its own. At first, he tried to brush it away with a nervous laugh, insisting that old houses play tricks on tired minds. But their pale faces and trembling voices made him hesitate. Finally, he sighed, lowering his voice. He explained that the house had belonged to the same family for generations. More than 2 centuries earlier, a young widow had been left behind there, her husband taken by illness not long after their marriage. She lived alone, refusing to remarry, her days spent in silence, her nights lit only by the faint glow of lanterns. Locals whispered that she poured tea every evening, always setting a place for her absent husband, waiting for a presence that never returned. When she died, the Machiya passed to her relatives, but the stories continued. Guests over the years reported the same things, sliding doors opening on their own, the soft rustle of fabric across tatami mats, and, most often, the faint sound of someone pouring tea in the still hours of the night. The host admitted that many locals believed she never left, that the widow's sorrow had become part of the house itself. The friends exchanged a glance, the memory of the filled teacup still vivid in their minds. What they had witnessed wasn't meant to frighten them. It was simply her routine, repeating endlessly, as though time itself refused to move on within those walls. That night they agreed not to challenge the house. They laid out their futons, left the teacup on the table, and whispered to one another that if she wanted her space, they would give it. But as the lanterns dimmed, the air shifted once more. A soft, sliding sound echoed from the hallway, followed by the faintest rustle of fabric. Neither of them dared to move. When morning came, they rose cautiously, half expecting to find the teacup empty. Instead, a second cup sat beside it, one they hadn't placed there. Both were filled, side by side, as if someone had been hosting tea for three. The friends packed quickly, leaving the cups untouched, their laughter brittle and forced, as they told the host they were cutting their trip short. They never spoke of it again. But sometimes, late at night, they both wonder who the third cup had really been meant for. From Hong Kong's haunted flat to Kyoto's restless widow, our journey has already shown how the past refuses to let go. But tonight's final story takes us even farther south, to the island of Bali. A place known for its beauty, its temples, and its endless fields of rice. Yet beneath the postcard surface, it's a land where spirits walk as freely as the living. A group of friends thought they had found paradise, a villa with a pool and views that belonged on the cover of a travel magazine. But paradise has shadows, and not every guest who visits comes from this world. What began as a dream vacation would soon turn into a waking nightmare when they realized the villa wasn't entirely theirs to share. The group had been planning the trip for months. 4 friends from Sydney, all in their mid-20s, chasing a break from work, studies, and the weight of daily routines. Bali was the obvious choice. It was cheap, close enough for a short flight, and promised everything they wanted: sun, nightlife, beaches, and the kind of luxury they couldn't afford back home. When they stumbled across the villa listing on Airbnb, it seemed almost too good to be true. The photos showed a modern paradise. A long infinity pool stretching toward rice fields that glowed gold in the setting sun. Open-air bedrooms, their white curtains drifting gently in the breeze. A lush garden filled with palm trees and frangipani flowers. And best of all, the price was less than half of what other villas nearby were charging. The reviews were short but positive, mentioning friendly staff and quiet surroundings. For the group, it seemed like fate. When they arrived, they couldn't stop filming everything on their phones: the garden, the pool, the open kitchen where the air smelled faintly of incense. They laughed as they chose rooms, tossing their bags on the crisp white linens, already imagining the nights ahead filled with laughter, drinks, and plans that would blur into the morning. But as the excitement settled, a different mood began to seep into the place. The villa was beautiful, yes, but it was also strangely quiet. Too quiet. The hum of scooters and nightlife that usually filled Bali seemed far away here, as though the villa stood on its own little island of silence. Even the rice fields beyond didn't stir. The air carried a stillness that none of them could explain. The first evening passed easily enough. They lounged by the pool, drank beer, and joked about how they had somehow scored the deal of a lifetime. Yet, every now and then, one of them would glance toward the garden. The shadows between the trees stretched long and dark, and the soft glow of the villa's lanterns didn't seem to chase them away. At one point, one of the girls asked if anyone else had noticed how the villa felt almost too empty, as if it were waiting. The others laughed, brushed it off, and poured another drink. Later that night, as they slipped into their separate bedrooms, the silence seemed to grow heavier. The open-air design, once so appealing in the photos, now made them feel strangely exposed. Curtains swayed in the night breeze, and the sound of distant dogs barking carried across the fields. From her room, one of the friends thought she heard movement in the garden, the faint crunch of footsteps on gravel. She peeked through the curtain but saw nothing. Only the white shimmer of moonlight across the pool. In the morning, no one mentioned anything strange. They joked about hangovers, planned their trip to the beach, and ordered nasi goreng from a nearby cafe. But underneath the laughter, a subtle unease lingered. The villa was beautiful, yes, but it didn't feel alive the way other places in Bali did. The offerings left at the small shrine near the entrance looked fresher than expected, as though someone had replaced them in the middle of the night. The incense was still faintly burning, though none of them had lit it. They told themselves it was just part of Balinese culture, part of what made the island so unique, and yet, whenever their eyes strayed to the garden, they felt the same quiet dread. The sense that the villa wasn't entirely theirs, that perhaps they were being tolerated rather than welcomed. They didn't know it yet, but their dream vacation was about to shift into something else. The villa they had chosen so carelessly, so excitedly, would not simply be a place to stay. It would become the center of nights they would never forget, nights where laughter gave way to silence, where shadows crept closer, and where the line between guest and intruder began to blur. The first night passed with the usual haze of travel fatigue, drinks by the pool, and joking arguments about who had picked the best bedroom. By the time the last of them stumbled off to bed, the villa seemed calm, even idyllic. But in the dark hours of the morning, something shifted. One of the girls, Emily, woke suddenly. She wasn't sure what had pulled her from sleep. The air was thick and warm, the sound of geckos clicking from somewhere near the ceiling. For a moment, she thought it was just the usual noises of Bali at night. But then she heard it, faint, deliberate movement in the garden, the crunch of gravel, the rustle of leaves, as though someone was walking slowly, carefully between the trees. At first, she smiled to herself, convinced one of the boys had gone outside to smoke, but when she listened more closely, her skin prickled. Whoever was moving wasn't in a hurry. The steps were too slow, too even, as if someone were drifting instead of walking. She pushed back the mosquito net, padded to the edge of her room, and parted the white curtain just slightly. That was when she saw her. A woman in white. Tall, thin, her hair long enough to spill over her shoulders and cover her face. She stood between the palm trees, her body faintly illuminated by the moonlight. Emily's breath caught in her throat. The woman wasn't moving, wasn't looking toward the house. She was just there, standing perfectly still, her pale dress swaying faintly in the breeze. Emily dropped the curtain instantly, heart pounding. She pressed her back to the wall, trying to make sense of it. A neighbor, she told herself. Someone from the village nearby. Maybe she had wandered into the wrong property, that was all. But deep down, the certainty in her chest said otherwise. In the morning, Emily told the others what she'd seen. They laughed, teasing her for letting the beer and jet lag play tricks on her. One of the boys, Liam, smirked and said, "Bali's full of weird hippies in white clothes. Probably some yoga teacher out for a midnight walk." The others agreed, and the tension dissolved into jokes and plans for the day. But that night, the sense of unease returned. This time, it was Tom, the oldest of the group, who woke in the middle of the night. He hadn't heard anything. No footsteps, no rustling leaves. Instead, it was the feeling that something was wrong. His eyes opened to the pale shimmer of moonlight on the pool outside, and there she was. The same woman. She wasn't far away now. She was standing at the edge of the garden, closer than before, her white dress stark against the dark trees. She didn't move, didn't sway, didn't breathe. Her head was bowed slightly, hair spilling forward to hide her face. Tom sat up, blinking hard, convinced his eyes were playing tricks. But when he rubbed his face and looked again, she was still there, watching, waiting. He whispered Emily's name from the room across the hall, his voice shaking. When she came groggily to the doorway, he pointed out toward the garden. By the time she looked, the space was empty. They argued in whispers, Emily insisting she had seen the same thing, Tom swearing it wasn't his imagination. But when the others woke to their hushed voices, they dismissed it again. Neighbors, shadows, maybe too many horror movies before bed. Still, the laughter felt thinner that day, forced. And when the group returned from the beach that evening, none of them could ignore the way the villa seemed to wait for them. Its silent garden stretching into shadows that felt too deep. They didn't say it aloud, but the question now lingered between them. If it was just a neighbor, why did she keep coming back? And why was she standing closer each night? By the third night, the villa no longer felt like a holiday home. The air was thick with silence, heavier than the humidity outside. Even the cicadas seemed to fall quiet when the group retreated to their rooms. What had once felt like paradise now seemed too vast, too empty, as though the walls were holding their breath, waiting. That evening, after dinner in town, they returned to find offerings placed neatly on the shrine near the entrance. Small baskets of flowers and rice, incense sticks burned low to ash. None of them had lit the incense. None of them had seen anyone come to the villa during the day. It should have been comforting, part of Balinese tradition, but instead, it unsettled them. Someone else had been here. Later, as they lounged by the pool, Liam noticed something strange. The garden lantern at the far end flickered on its own, dimming and brightening, as though a shadow kept passing in front of it. He called the others over, but when they looked, the light was steady. They teased him until he fell quiet, but a nervous edge lingered in their voices. That night, Emily woke again, this time to a sound she couldn't explain. A soft scraping, like fingernails dragging across wood. It came from the open doorway of her room. Frozen under the mosquito net, she forced her eyes toward the sound. At the threshold stood the woman in white. Her head was still bowed, hair covering her face, but now she was inside the villa, standing just a step away from the bedroom. Emily gasped, fumbling for her phone, but in the split second she blinked, the doorway was empty. Only the faint scent of damp earth lingered in the air. By morning, she couldn't keep quiet. She told the group everything, her voice shaking, her hands trembling as she described the figure at her door. For the first time, the others didn't laugh. The joking had evaporated. Tom admitted he hadn't slept at all, convinced that someone was pacing outside his room. Liam confessed he had locked his door, something he never usually bothered with. They were all feeling it now. The villa wasn't theirs. Still, they tried to push it aside, not wanting to ruin the holiday. They spent the day at the beach, swam until sunset, and returned to the villa determined to pretend nothing was wrong. But when they arrived, the housekeeper was waiting. She was an older woman, quiet and polite, but her eyes seemed troubled as she looked at them. In broken English, she asked if everything was okay at night. The group exchanged uneasy glances. No one wanted to answer at first. Finally, Emily asked why she would say that. The woman hesitated, then muttered something about the land being old, about spirits who don't like changes. She wouldn't explain further, only bowing her head quickly and leaving as soon as her work was done. That night, things escalated further. It was Liam who woke first, his chest tight with unease. He turned toward the garden and froze. The woman in white was back, but now she was standing at the very edge of the pool. Her feet didn't break the surface of the water. She hovered just above it, her reflection faint and distorted in the moonlit ripples. He called out sharply, waking the others. They stumbled from their rooms, groggy and alarmed. And for a moment, they all saw her together. A pale figure in white, head bowed, hair cascading like a curtain, her body perfectly still. Then, with a flicker of lantern light, she vanished. Panic rippled through the group. Tom shouted that they should call the host. Emily was nearly in tears, and even Liam, who had been dismissive before, couldn't mask the fear in his voice. They argued in hushed tones, the villa's silence pressing in heavier with each word. Finally, Tom dialed the host. His voice shook as he demanded an explanation. The host was quiet for a long moment before answering. His tone was calm but uneasy, his words careful. He told them they were safe, that there was nothing to worry about. But when Tom pressed harder, asking directly about the woman in white, the host's voice cracked ever so slightly. He admitted that locals believed the land was haunted, tied to a Kuntilanak, a restless female spirit born of betrayal or tragedy during childbirth. Some said she wandered between homes, seeking acknowledgement. Others claimed she waited for new guests, watching, always drawing closer. The host added quickly that it was just stories, that many people lived peacefully nearby. But the damage was done. The name alone sent a chill through the group. Now they knew it wasn't just shadows or stress or imagination. It was something older, something tied to the villa itself. That night, none of them slept. Every curtain, every shadow seemed to move. And the question that hung between them was worse than the silence. If she had already stepped inside the villa, how much closer would she come? That night, the villa felt like it had shrunk around them. The wide, open-air design that had once felt luxurious now felt like a trap. Too many doors, too many thin curtains, too much space where someone or something could slip inside. They had dragged their futons closer together in one room, leaving the lanterns burning low, desperate for the comfort of being near one another. Nobody admitted it aloud, but none of them wanted to sleep alone again. For hours, they whispered nervously, trying to distract themselves. They told jokes that fell flat, argued about whether to leave in the morning, and clung to the idea that the stories about the Kuntilanak were just folklore. But then, sometime past midnight, the laughter died away. A sound moved through the villa. At first it was faint, like the soft swish of fabric brushing against wood. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing softly across the tiles near the pool. Everyone fell silent, holding their breath. The footsteps stopped, and in the heavy pause that followed, they heard it. A woman's soft, strangled sob. Emily clutched Liam's arm so tightly her nails dug into his skin. Tom, trembling, pushed himself to his feet and edged toward the curtain that looked out over the pool. Against his better judgment, he pulled it aside, just enough to see. She was there. The woman in white stood at the far end of the pool, her back bent slightly, her hair spilling forward like a veil. She swayed, ever so slightly, her arms hanging limp at her sides. The sound of her crying carried across the water, broken and muffled, as though she were weeping into her own hands. But then, as Tom watched in horrified silence, she lifted her head. Her face was pale, too pale. Her mouth twisted into something between a sob and a smile. Her eyes sunken, hollow, locked onto his. Tom stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. The others scrambled up, and Emily shouted at him to close the curtain, but it was too late. The crying grew louder, closer, even though the figure still stood at the far end of the pool. It was as if her grief was inside the villa now, spilling through the walls. Then the lanterns flickered. Every one of them, all at once. Shadows stretched long and unnatural, bending across the floor and walls like reaching hands. Liam grabbed his phone, fumbling for the flashlight, but before he could switch it on, the room plunged into darkness. The lanterns had all gone out. The crying stopped. Silence swallowed them, the kind of silence that roared in the ears, heavier than sound itself, and then footsteps. Not outside, not by the pool, inside the villa, crossing the tiles. Coming closer, Emily whimpered, covering her face. The group huddled together, their breath shallow, waiting for the sound to stop. But the footsteps didn't stop. They circled the room, slow and deliberate, pausing at each corner as if the figure was examining them. When the lanterns sputtered back to life, she was standing in the doorway, the woman in white. Her hair hung wet and tangled, dripping onto the tiles. Her head was bowed low, but her shoulders heaved, as if with silent laughter or sobbing. Slowly, so slowly, she lifted her face, Her mouth was wide open, her lips stretched impossibly thin, her hollow eyes locked onto them. Emily screamed. Liam shoved the futons aside, grabbing her arm, and Tom threw open the side door that led into the garden. They stumbled out into the night air, barefoot and panicked, their breaths ragged as they sprinted toward the gate. Behind them, the villa loomed, the lanterns flickering wildly as though in a storm. But the worst part wasn't the sight of the figure in the doorway, nor the sound of her wailing that now carried across the rice fields. It was what they saw when they glanced back one final time. There were no footprints in the dew-covered tiles where she had stood, no sign of anyone at all. Only the wide, gaping doorway, yawning open into the villa's hollow silence, as if it had swallowed her whole again. For the first time, the friends realized this wasn't just a haunting, it wasn't just a spirit passing through. Whatever she was, she belonged to the villa, and she had let them see her because she wanted them to know it. The four of them didn't sleep after that night. They huddled together on the couches in the living room until dawn, too terrified to step back into their bedrooms, the mosquito nets hanging loose like ghostly veils. Every small sound set them on edge. The creak of the beams, the bark of dogs outside, even the faint rustle of palm leaves in the wind. When the sun finally broke over the rice fields, none of them spoke for a long time. They just sat in silence, staring at the light as if it could wash away the memory of what they had seen. By mid-morning, Tom insisted they needed answers. He called the host again, this time refusing to let him brush things off. His voice was sharp, desperate, demanding to know what exactly was happening in the villa. After several tense minutes of evasive replies, the host finally agreed to come by. When he arrived, his expression gave him away. He looked pale, his smile forced, his eyes avoiding the corners of the house. He listened quietly as they told him everything. The woman in the garden, the crying, the lanterns, the figure in the doorway. The host didn't laugh this time. He didn't call it imagination or brush it off as folklore. Instead, he sighed and lowered his voice. He told them the villa was new, but the land was not. Years before, the fields belonged to a local family. According to the villagers, a young woman from that family had died under violent and tragic circumstances. Some said she had been betrayed by her husband, abandoned while carrying his child. Others claimed she had been left to die after complications in childbirth. The stories differed, but one detail was always the same. The woman was said to have been buried nearby, her soul restless, her grief unresolved. Locals believed she had become a kuntilanak, a spirit tied to suffering, betrayal, and death in childbirth. The kind of ghost who didn't move on, who lingered near the place of her pain, weeping for eternity. In Bali, people avoided such places. They believed the spirits of women like her grew stronger when ignored, hungrier when left without offerings. The host admitted reluctantly that this was the reason the villa was priced lower than others in the area. Foreigners saw only a bargain, but locals avoided staying overnight. Some even crossed to the other side of the road when walking past the property. Hearing this, the group felt the floor drop beneath them. The strange silence of the villa, the offerings left on the shrine, the incense that seemed freshly burned. Suddenly, all of it made sense. The housekeeper hadn't been checking in for them. She had been tending to the spirit, keeping her at bay, or at least appeased, with daily prayers and offerings. Emily asked, her voice trembling, why the host hadn't warned them, why he had let them stay, knowing what lingered there. His answer chilled them. If I tell, no one books. If I don't tell, sometimes nothing happens. Sometimes guests don't notice. His words hung heavy in the air, uncomfortably honest. The group sat in stunned silence. They realized then that the spirit hadn't appeared to them by accident. Each night she had come closer, first in the garden, then at the pool, then inside. She hadn't been ignored. She had been waiting. Acknowledging her seemed to draw her nearer, as if their attention fed her grief. The host left soon after, his visit brief and uncomfortable, but his words stayed with them. They weren't imagining it. They weren't cursed tourists making a fuss. They had walked into a place that carried its own history, its own wounds, and its own rules. When night came again, they felt a shift in the villa. The shadows seemed thicker, the silence heavier. None of them dared to look toward the garden. None of them wanted to know if she was standing there again. Because now, they understood something they hadn't before. The villa wasn't haunted by accident. It wasn't just a home with a shadow in its past. It was her place. And no matter how many people stayed there, drank by the pool, or slept under its white curtains, she would always return. She had nowhere else to go. And the more they thought about it, the more one question gnawed at them. If the host and the housekeeper already knew she was there, then why had the offerings on the shrine looked so fresh on the nights before she appeared? Was someone trying to keep her away? Or was someone deliberately keeping her close? The decision was made the following morning. None of them could bear another night in the villa. They packed in silence, their belongings shoved hastily into suitcases, the air thick with exhaustion and dread. Even as they zipped their bags shut, none of them dared to look toward the garden. It felt like an invitation, as though the moment they acknowledged the trees, she might appear again. When the driver arrived to take them to a hotel in Seminyak, the relief was almost overwhelming. They loaded their bags quickly, each of them glancing nervously over their shoulders at the villa. The house looked quiet, innocent even, bathed in the warm glow of the morning sun. For a moment, Emily wondered if it had all been a hallucination, a shared fever dream fueled by nerves and too many ghost stories. But then she saw it. At the far edge of the garden, beyond the pool, a faint figure stood between the palms, not moving, not waving, just watching. She blinked hard, and the figure was gone. She didn't say anything, neither did the others. Somehow, she knew they had all seen it too. The drive to Seminyak was tense, filled with the kind of silence that carried unspoken agreement. They wouldn't talk about it, not to each other, not to anyone else. When they arrived at the new hotel, bustling with tourists and music and life, it felt like stepping back into the real world. A world where nothing followed you out of the garden, nothing cried in the night, nothing watched from the doorway. They tried to salvage the holiday, but the villa hung over them like a shadow. Nights filled with music and laughter felt thinner, forced, as if a part of them had been left behind. On their last night in Bali, Tom received a notification from Airbnb, a polite message from the villa's host asking if they would like to leave a review. His hand hovered over the screen for a long time. What could he write? That the villa was beautiful, clean, exactly as pictured? Or that it was already occupied and the true host never left? He closed the app without answering. Some places don't need reviews. They already have a reputation, one written not in stars or comments, but in silence, offerings, and the footsteps that echo long after you leave. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you like them and want to listen to more, feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best.